The mechanisms of evolution and the fossil evidence fail to explain either the origin or the advancement of life. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the evolutionary community continues to espouse a worn-out theory. So why do so many scientists accept evolution and reject creation as the correct explanation for our existence? They are trained to leave God out of their thinking. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, Blind to the Obvious with Bruce Malone. Today's guest, Bruce Malone, earned a degree in chemical engineering and has 27 years' experience as a research leader with the Dow Chemical Corporation, while holding 17 patents for new products. In 2008, he became the executive director of Search for the Truth Ministries. This organization distributes Bible-affirming creation materials to students and prisoners internationally, giving away thousands of resources. Bruce speaks on the scientific evidence supporting creation at schools and churches around the world and has authored 7 books on this important subject. Welcome to the program, Bruce.
Thank you for having me, Ray.
Well, the title for this show is Blind to the Obvious. I see you've brought some props with us, so I'm sort of blind to where we're going right now.
Well, this is a very important subject because the textbooks are filled with authoritative statements about how evolution's a fact, and yet God says in Romans 1, verses 18 through 21, what may be known about him is obvious because of what he has made. So how can the world around us be so blind to what God says is so obvious, that there is a creator?
Well, that is an interesting question. We have God's clear word saying it should be clear.
Should be obvious.
And man is saying the opposite.
The opposite.
So something doesn't work there.
Well, let's start by talking about what does the world say about where everything came from, where people, where all of life came from. Basically, from the time of Charles Darwin in 1859 onward, scientists increasingly accepted the idea that mutations and natural selection have transformed one form of life into a totally different form of life. Basically by this equation, the idea that very simple life like bacteria, if there are little changes and those changes have an advantage, mutations are just random changes to any form of life, and they do happen. Natural selection is the idea that some characteristics of an animal have an advantage, and that is all true. It will slowly, over lots of time, change bacteria into more complex life that'll turn into fish, that'll turn into land animals, that'll turn into mammals and birds and monkeys and eventually people. And it's all presented as a fact of history throughout our educated world today. We observe things adapting. Animals will adapt to different environments. And because those things are called evolution, students assume everything that's called evolution is true. For instance, here's a quote from a college textbook. It says, this animal that you're looking at is a well-preserved skeleton of a megastronodon. Sounds very scientific, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Oh, very scientific. And it allows an accurate reconstruction of our own earliest ancestor. Now, that's not stated as a theory, it's stated as a fact of science. Now, just to make that a little less technical, what we're being told is this little critter is Grandpa. Now, you say, well, my grandpa didn't look like that, but how about your great-grandpa, or your great-great-great-great-grandpa, or great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa?
Yes.
That's what it is saying as a fact of history. But let's go back to simple life. Could chemicals come alive? That's what we're told. Our young people, as they watch movies, Star Trek and Star Wars and all of these alien movies and the Transformers and so on, it is implied life pops up all over the universe, just in lots of forms and varieties, because chemicals have come together and then advanced into advanced forms of life. And yet we've run an experiment billions of times a year where we put every chemical needed to form life in a container, and then heat or light could pass through it. And then we open the can to see, does a new form of life form? And I think you can guess by looking at the picture what I'm talking about. Canned food has all the chemicals needed to make life. They're all there. They're just canned in a can. Yet no one ever pops up their can of food and out crawls a new little alien creature. Billions of times a year we do it. Nothing new and alive ever develops. The answer is absolutely obvious. Life can't form itself, and every experiment shows this. So why do people still believe it's happening? I'll answer this question near the end.
Okay.
So the very first part of the equation falls apart. Simple life is not simple, and it never comes alive because chemicals come alive.
So that's the first step that they are starting with.
Already everything falls apart.
Yeah.
See, every step has to be true. It's step one times step two times step three. The answer for number one is 0, so the rest of it doesn't even work. So let's look at mutations. Well, okay, we have a problem with simple life. The best example I've been able to come up with for a mutation is the idea of, can random mistakes add useful functions and energy to a structure? So I grabbed a structure, a memory stick, a flash drive. Now, when I bought this flash drive, it was 512 megabytes, and it cost me about $100. Now, young people are laughing already. They can't even remember that far. So let's add a mutation to my memory stick. So I drove a nail through it. You know, I just took my old hammer and went wham! Knocked my nail through there. That is a mutation. It's a cosmic ray coming down and blowing apart part of a DNA, a rearrangement of the language inside of the nucleus of a cell, just a random rearrangement of parts. Now, maybe the nail will connect a couple circuits that didn't used to be connected. So I tested it, and it didn't work better. So I added some more mutations, and each time it would not hold more information.
Remind me never to bring my computer to you when it's not
So then I
well.
added more mutations, and I tried it and tested it and tried it and tested it, and then more mutations. Guess what? It did not cause increased ability or function. You see, mutations are not the answer. They will change things, but they do not ever, in any example, add functional information. We've done this experiment thousands of times since the early 1900s, where we took fruit flies. They have a 14-day life cycle. We add radiation, so we increase their mutation rate by thousands of times. We do it with thousands of fruit flies. So we're simulating millions of years of evolutionary progress. What we get are twisted wings, bent wings, different colors, dead fruit flies, non-functioning fruit flies, extra wings. We've never gotten a new creature. We've never gotten a new feature. We've never gotten a new function. We've never gotten an improvement. So we do an experiment. Do mutations advance things? The result is crystal clear. They never cause an advancement.
And now we're not talking about theory, we're talking about scientific laboratory results.
Reproducible experimentation. Now, the change in certain cases may be useful. In other words, a blind man in a movie theater where the lights go out and someone yells, "Fire," will actually have an advantage over people who aren't blind. But no one would say blindness will cause an advancement of humanity or an advancement. It's just in a specific application it may be useful. But you're never adding new body structures, better information. So how about natural selection? Supposedly, that is what made Charles Darwin the most famous scientist in the 1800s. He proposed little changes, if they're useful, could cause one animal to advance into another. Now, does it work or not? That's the point. Is it true or not? Not could it be true, is it true? Dr. John Sanford, he's one of the world's top geneticists, invented the gene gun, the ability to put information from one cell into another cell of another plant. He came up with this illustration, and I love it because it's the clearest thing I've ever seen to show this can't be true. Evolution does not work. And this is how he explains it. Suppose you have a wagon, and this is analogous to a bacteria, a very simple form of transportation. And when I was young, I loved my wagon. I would ride around in my wagon. It was my mode of transportation. But as my friends got older, they got bicycles and mopeds and eventually cars. But just imagine I'm still riding around in my wagon. Now, why? Because I'm a dreamer. I don't just want a motorcycle. I don't just want a car. I don't even just want a bigger wagon like this.
That's a big wagon.
That's a big wagon. What I really wanted, because I grew up in the 60s, I wanted to ride around in the Starship Enterprise.
Okay.
Now, the difference between this little wagon and a Starship Enterprise is like the difference between a bacteria and a human body. Enormous amounts of information have to be added to the factory making wagons to start turning out starships. warp drive engines, photon torpedoes, transporter beams, okay? Lots of information. If this is a bacteria, to make a human, you could add skin and brains and livers and hearts and blood cells and all this other stuff that doesn't exist. How's that going to happen? Well, the only thing evolution has to work with are mutations. And we now know if the wagon rolls off the assembly line to make the next wagon, it has to take the information in its DNA code, if it's a bacteria, to make the next bacteria. That's like a book attached to the bottom of the wagon. Let's say this book is 100 pages long, pretty simple genetic code, and I've now made 100 changes. Do you think you could take that book where there's one misspelled word and 100 pages later there's another misspelled word and you could read and understand that book? What do you think?
Sure, I would think so.
Yeah, we run into that all the time. So you take the book, probably the second wagon will be fine. 1,000 wagons later, there's 10 mistakes on every page. Now, is that process ever going to turn that wagon into the Starship Enterprise?
No, not at all.
See, again, it is obvious, and every geneticist knows this. Everything is winding down, it's not getting better. But this is what students are told. Well, maybe the word red could get changed to blue. That's possible. You know, random changes, I suppose it's possible. But that blue wagon will take with it every single mistake that's been building up and building up. See, natural selection is like the quality control department. It can see the wagon. Did the wheels spin? Is it the right size? Will it sell well in the market? But it can't see the book. Natural selection can't see the DNA code. It can't correct the changes. And they slowly destroy the information. This is reality. Yeah. And natural selection can't stop it. So the truth is obvious. Mutations, natural selection will never advance one form of life into a totally different form of life. Let me give you two examples of how intelligent people can be completely blinded by the obvious. See, what they do is assume evolution because they leave God out of their thinking. They'll line up ape skulls, and there's lots of variation, human skulls, and lots of variation. This is a chart right from the Smithsonian Institute where a student looks at that and says, wow, you know, skull number 1 up here is obviously an ape. Skull at the end is obviously a human, and you see this sequence right from one to another leading to the other. Evolution must be true. Well, if you look at that variation, it looks significant, but let's look at another set of skulls. For instance, suppose I've been trained, evolution's a fact, millions of years, billions of years to form the rock layer, and I find this skull way down deep in the rocks. Okay? If I find it first, I might get to name it. I'll call it, say, the Bruceosaurus, okay? And it looks like a pretty vicious critter,
Yes,
but then I keep digging. And further up, I'm assuming the rocks are younger. Suppose I come across this skull, okay? Same shape, same essential size. This one has one ridge. This one has 2 ridges across the top. Where did it come from? I'm going to assume this one had babies. They were different sizes, different shapes, different variations. Maybe this one lived where there were lots of trees and rocks, and by being smaller, it could hide behind them better, and it had an advantage. So this one evolved over time and turned into this one. Just a little bit different variation. Now suppose I keep digging, and now I find this skull. Now you'll notice his jaw is sticking way out, and his brain is bigger. He has a much more domed forehead. How did it get there? Where did he come from? If God didn't make him, he must have evolved. It's the only other option. Well, maybe I'll say to myself, by his jaw getting longer and longer, he'd dig under rocks and get little critters and bugs better. And the longer his jaw stuck out, the better he could dig, and his brain got bigger to allow him to use his parts in different ways. So one of those creatures slowly evolved into another creature over time. Little changes had an advantage, slowly changed him. And then finally, suppose I dig up this guy. It's like eureka, look at the size of the brain on that guy. He's little, but he's got this huge brain. He must be really, really smart. He's like the Einstein of this kind of creature. And he's got to be, because he's so small, he's got to have a big brain to survive. So see, I've used evolution to explain where all these creatures came from, and it sounds really convincing.
It does, but it's pure speculation. There's not a shred of proof of any of that.
I've got the skulls. I mean, surely they didn't just poof appear. So they must have evolved and slowly changed. It's going to sound very authoritative to the students. Now let me show you what those animals actually are. The first one was a wolf. This is a wolf skull. The second one was a fox. That's a fox skull.
Similar animal.
The third one is actually a bulldog. And this little guy, he's not the Einstein of this kind of creature. He's a stupid little chihuahua. He wouldn't last for 2 weeks in the woods with the wolf.
That's right. Those animals wouldn't even be if it wasn't for man's ingenuity in
All of
them.
these creatures genetically are the same kind. When God said he created different kinds in Genesis 1, that doesn't mean there's lots of variation. All of them interbreed. They can all be traced genetically back to the wolf. The wolf had a book of information to create lots of variety. And look at the variety.
And just looking at the skulls, you wouldn't know
that. But genetically, we know it's true. There's no evolution. It's called evolution, but it's just change and variety built into their DNA code. Now, those skulls of apes to humans, they're either variations of apes or variations of humans with enormous differences in between. The DNA code of apes and humans have now been decoded, and there's somewhere between 100 million and 300 million differences. So it's somewhere between 10 and 30% completely different. That's like a Grand Canyon-sized gulf of information that's never been filled. So we know the truth. Evolution is not true. It's a misinterpretation.
Seems like it's becoming more obvious, but we are becoming more adamantly blind. Bruce, it seems obvious when we look at these skulls and we see exactly what they are, that evolution couldn't be true, and yet the scientists hold on to this theory.
The world around us seems to be like totally blind to what is really quite obvious couldn't be true. Now, why is that? Well, I'm going to answer my own question. The father of modern psychology, a man named Dr. William James, first man to teach psychology at Harvard University, after studying how human beings learn, how they come to believe what they believe his entire life, he made this statement. He said, "Nothing is too absurd to be believed if it's simply repeated often enough." And that's exactly what's going on throughout our education system. Students are only allowed to hear evolution, 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 millions of years, billions of years. And they'll hear it thousands, tens of thousands of times through their education. They don't get to see the problems with evolution. They don't get to hear any alternative to evolution. So it becomes their framework of reality. Now, there was an experiment done over 50 years ago where a scientist decided to find out, does our brain have to interpret things a certain way, or can it interpret them any way it wants? Now, our eyes actually have a lens in them that flips the light waves upside down. So as you're looking at me, in the back of your retina, I am actually upside down. This scientist decided to find out, is that like wired permanently, or can the brain choose to interpret things any way it wants? Watch this little film.
If seeing were done only in the eye, everything would be upside down to us. Just as in a camera, the lens of the eye forms the image upside down. The image is then inverted by the brain so that it appears right side up. Now, what would happen if a lens system were used to form the image right side up? Well, the brain would immediately invert the image so that it would be upside down. But would this condition be permanent? To answer this question, we asked Mr. Gratz, our optical expert, to design for us a pair of inverting spectacles. While the spectacles were being constructed in our shop, we faced the problem of who was going to wear the things continuously for several weeks. You'll want to meet our unlucky winner. That's right, me. Even from the first, it was possible to walk in this topsy-turvy fashion, but it didn't take long to develop a rollicking case of seasickness. We decided that for your sake as well as ours, we'd better conduct our first test sitting down. However, just sitting down wasn't so easy. Even the simplest tasks were at first impossible. No amount of concentration or effort could overcome the compulsion to reach in the wrong direction. The inverting spectacles had to be worn every waking moment during the entire period of the experiment. Anytime the glasses were removed, the eyes were closed or fully covered. Walking to work upside down was an exhausting experience, but it provided a valuable period of relearning and reorientation. It also caused quite a stir in the neighborhood. Gradually, it became easier to get around in this upside-down world. By a slow and painful process, the image in the brain had been erected.
Now, this has profound implications. You see, it wasn't after 1 week things were at 45 degrees, and after 10 days things are at 70 degrees. His brain kept getting in the opposite information than what it believed to be true. It's like things are upside down, they ought to be right side up. Things are upside down, they ought to be right side up. They're 180 degrees backwards. Eventually, his brain decided what used to be the opposite of what I believe to be true must be the truth, because it's all the information that was coming in, all that visual stimulus. And it flipped the image right side up. One day it was upside down, the next day it's right side up. He couldn't make it happen, and then he couldn't see things any other way. When he took the glasses off, everything was upside down again.
That's fascinating.
That's what the human brain is capable of. If you program someone to only hear and believe one possibility, no matter how absurd, that chemicals could just come alive, that random mistakes to a coded information of DNA could cause it to advance into another creature, that life could just pop up into existence, they will eventually believe it. And then when you put proof in front of them it couldn't possibly be true, they can't even see it. It can't get through. So the professors, the textbooks, they're not stupid. They've been trained to think in a way that leaves God and God's Word out of their thinking. And what's God tell us? God says, thy Word, God's Word is the lamp unto my feet and the light unto my path. God tells us, trust the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Acknowledge Him and He will direct your paths. Because if we don't, how do we know what we believe is true? Especially if it's about history and stuff we can't go back and see how it happened. And when we do that, when we examine the world around us based on what He's told us, different forms of life were created as distinctly different kinds. It's exactly what we find. That there has been a world-covering flood that created the rock layers and the fossils. It's exactly what the data indicates. It's just misinterpreted because we're leaving out what God has told us.
And it seems like we have less and less of an excuse. The more science is able to get into the details, the more clearly it had to be from a creator, from intelligence, with purpose.
But only if you're willing to acknowledge this is a book of reality. Otherwise, evolution is the only possibility, and it just becomes increasingly blinding.
Bruce, thanks so much for joining us.
It has been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. As we saw in today's program, there is a blindness in man. It's not there because he can't see the evidence so much as he doesn't want to see it. Man doesn't want to acknowledge what the Bible says is plain from the creation, that there is a creator. And so suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, he does not admit the God whom he knows is there. Well, we saw in today's program that the evidence does show us that there is a God, there must be a God, there must be a designer for everything that is made. And it goes to show us once again that we know what the Bible says is true, and the proof is all around you. If you enjoy Origins, we could use your help to keep this creation television program on the air. We have a whole team of people behind the scenes in the control room that make every one of these programs work. We also need, however, a team of prayerful and financial support behind the camera and in the homes. Won't you consider supporting this program so that we can continue to make programs that show God is the creator and the Bible is true? Be part of our team, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins.